Welcome to orientation at Jennie Stewart Health. My name is Eric Lee. I'm President and CEO of Jennie Stewart Health, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our orientation session. We're pleased to welcome you to Jennie Stewart. You're joining our organization at a very dynamic time, and we're a health system that is geared around tremendous growth and impact in Western Kentucky. I have the privilege of presenting a program to you this morning about the history of Jennie Stewart Health, because I feel that if we understand, and the more we understand about the history of our hospital, our medical group, and our health system, the better we can understand where we're going and plan a roadmap to the future. We have a very dynamic organization. We have a stated goal of becoming an employer of choice, and we want to create a work environment that is rewarding, that is safe, that provides an opportunity for growth, and we're excited that you are joining our health system at this time in our hospital's long history. I have the privilege of being able to share with you the story, and I like to refer to it as a love story, but it is the story of Jennie Stewart and the creation of our health system and the dynamic health system that we have today, as it started as a community hospital well over 100 years ago. The very genesis of the story of Jennie Stewart Health begins shortly after the American Civil War, and there was a young physician by the name of Edward S. Stewart who had completed his medical training and was really looking for a place to settle in practice. He had tried, after the Civil War, he had tried practicing in a couple of locations. One was Crofton, Kentucky. But because of the readily available access to other physicians, or general practitioners as they were referred to in the day, he was not satisfied that he was able to build a robust practice, or at least a practice that was achieving what he wanted to achieve in life. And so it became evident to him, and he was made aware that there was an opportunity for a physician in the farming community of Fairview, Kentucky. Dr. Stewart heard through some acquaintances and friends that a local general practitioner that had taken care of that area for a number of years was no longer there, and that community was in desperate need for a physician. To truly understand the dynamics, you have to realize that in the 19th century, post the American Civil War, healthcare really began at home. It began at home for the vast majority of Americans. You were born at home, and your healthcare throughout your lifespan was delivered in your household. You were born at home. You received medical care throughout your life because your physician made house calls to your residents and took care of the mother, the father, the grandparents, and an individual's siblings. Took care of everyone in the household through the process of making house calls. They would ride on horseback or come in a buggy and make house calls. And that was the American healthcare delivery system. And as a result, people were born at home and they died at home. Hospitals were really more institutions of training. They weren't the ubiquitous institutions that we know in our communities today. Hospitals had a very different role. They were often experimental, they were training grounds, and quite honestly, in the 19th century, hospitals weren't known for being particularly clean or particularly safe places for people to go and receive health care. They were often an institution of last resort as people were dealing with very complex diseases or trying to find ways to develop a cure or cure themselves or a family member. So healthcare was we were operating in a very different time as American citizens in the late 19th century. And so the physician, the community physician, was really the key to healthcare. And Dr. Stewart explored the Fairview community. He traveled to the area and recognized very quickly that it would provide a great opportunity for him and one that he was seeking. It probably didn't take very long for the people in that community once Dr. Stewart had made the commitment to come to Fairview. It probably didn't take the residents of that area very long to figure out that here was this tall, handsome young man who was a physician, and he was also single. So I like to joke occasionally that I suspect Dr. Stewart received a lot of personal invitations to the myriad of social events that would occur in a farming community in the late 19th century. As people in Fairview planned square dances or harvest festivals or church potluck suppers or barn raisings or whatever activities that would bring people together socially in that community in that day and time. I'm sure Dr. Stewart was personally invited because people in that area knew that there would be eligible young women interested in meeting him. It was at one of those events that Dr. Stewart met this beautiful, petite young spitfire of a lady that everybody referred to as Jennie. She was known by her family and friends as Jennie. Her real name was Jane E. Vaughn, but everybody called her Jennie or Miss Jennie. And she was a dynamic, energetic young lady, and I'm sure Dr. Stewart was immediately smitten by her. If you think about the Hollywood movies where two people meet and the sky changes colors and the fireworks go off or comets race across the sky, that's a little bit of the imagery I like to have when I think about Dr. Stewart meeting Miss Jennie. But they met, they were immediately very engaged with each other, and after what I suspect was a whirlwind courtship, Dr. Stewart asked for Miss Jennie's hand in marriage. Upon being wed, they found a wonderful two-story home in the Fairview community. It had a big front porch where Miss Jennie could hang her parakeets, had lots of gingerbread detailing, and she would hang live ferns and parakeets, and she really enjoyed the outdoors. She loved being a homemaker. She was very smart and energetic. Dr. Stewart had already very quickly established himself as a wonderful physician, a high-quality physician in that farming community. And so, as you can imagine, Dr. Stewart and Miss Jennie quickly became the darlings of Fairview, Kentucky. It was after a period of time that the real depth of Miss Jennie's talent came to be known. Dr. Stewart was very popular, provided great care, worked very hard, and was very diligent in the application of his practice of medicine in providing care. He treated everyone in that community as though they were his family, and he was much loved. But what they recognized, what Dr. Stewart and Miss Jennie recognized very quickly, was that together they had a multiplying factor on their talents. Miss Jennie had a very good mind for business. She was very good in her accounting skills, in her organization skills. And so Miss Jennie became the chief financial officer for Dr. Stewart's medical practice, and she was also the head scheduler, the business office manager, the director of environmental services, the materials management director, the list goes on and on. Her level of financial acumen and organization really helped multiply the impact Dr. Stewart was able to have on that community. And think about Western Kentucky. In the years following the Civil War, Reconstruction was ongoing throughout the South. Kentucky had very much been impacted by the difficulties of the Civil War, and it was a difficult time economically for all families in Western Kentucky. Agriculture was the primary source of food and shelter and income for families, and money was not necessarily plentiful. And Miss Jennie was very resourceful because she understood that there were more than one way to build wealth. And she also knew the level of pride that people in West Kentucky had in terms of wanting to pay their obligations and meet the needs of their debts, and how important that was to the residents of this area at that point in time. And so Miss Jennie, if a family didn't have the cash or the money to pay for the care that Dr. Stewart had rendered, she was very capable of bartering and bargaining with families and finding ways to take the fruits of their agricultural labors as payment for Dr. Stewart's services from time to time. And so she would take small livestock or canned goods or produce. She was very resourceful at working with families to help them maintain their pride by satisfying their obligations and building wealth in other forms. And so Miss Jennie, in addition to the success that she had in working with Dr. Stewart to build his practice, she also built a small farming operation there at their home and took great joy in raising a garden and having the fruits of that area's agricultural harvest as part of their home and the livestock that she maintained. She was extremely resourceful. She made sure that Dr. Stewart had the supplies and the materials he needed to successfully do his job, and she made sure he was where he was supposed to be when he was supposed to be there. Dr. Stewart and Miss Jennie enjoyed a number of years of tremendous success in the Fairview community. The real tragedy in their love story comes to play as they developed the idea that they wanted to grow their family. And like many people that lived in that era, they had visions of a house full of small children where they would raise a family and the joys that would accompany that. Dr. Stewart and Miss Jennie had 3 children as a result of their marriage relationship, but unfortunately, tragedy struck very early for them as they became parents. They had 2 children die shortly after birth. It was a very difficult thing for them to endure. The impact on them individually and on their marriage was significant. As one can imagine, losing a child is not the natural order of things. And that was very hurtful and depressing for both Dr. Stewart and Miss Jennie. They persevered. They helped life go on, but certainly the loss of 2 of their children in very young childhood was very difficult for them, despite the fact that childhood disease and death was much more prevalent in the late 19th century, particularly when you compare it to the general success that we have in children being born healthy and happy here in the United States. The Stewarts did have 1 daughter. She actually lived into early adulthood. She was a beautiful young woman. Dr. Stewart and Miss Jennie had hopes of a university education for her, and she was showing much accomplishment as a student and as a piano player. She had an interest in music, and Dr. Stewart and Miss Jennie had hopes of a university education for her. Unfortunately, that was not to be, as she contracted scarlet fever and succumbed to that illness within a matter of weeks at an early young age in her early 20s. That was a devastating blow for Dr. Stewart and Miss Jennie. And I believe personally that Miss Jennie had suppressed a lot of her depression and feelings that resulted from the loss of her first 2 children, because she had made an effort to remain strong and stay strong for their daughter who remained with them. And upon her death, one can imagine the tremendous anguish and pain that Dr. Stewart and Miss Jennie experienced. I think Dr. Stewart was able to deal with his depression and his pain because he had patients who needed him. He had a community who needed him. And I think Dr. Stewart threw himself into his work and worked even longer days, got up even earlier to begin his patient visits. And he had the comfort and the contact with the people that he took care of day in and day out that really helped him deal with the depression and the sadness that he was feeling. But if we put ourselves in Miss Jennie's shoes, she was a very successful businesswoman, was a tremendous supporter of her husband, but she was a homemaker. She had her thoughts, her memories, and four walls to keep her company pretty much day in and day out. That made things increasingly difficult for her. And I think with the rush of emotions that probably came back up, the memories of the loss of her two children who died when they were very young, and coupling that with the loss of their early adult daughter, I think the pressure of that was just more than she could bear. We have to keep in mind that an understanding of mental health in the late 19th century was not anywhere near what it is today. Just as non-clinical people, most of us are able to understand that if we are going through a time of depression, or if we recognize symptoms of depression in someone who is close to us, we recognize that there's provider intervention. There are trained professionals to help us deal with mental health issues. There are support groups, there are church support groups, community support groups. There's pharmaceutical intervention. None of those tools or resources existed in the 19th century. It was very difficult for Dr. Stewart and Miss Jennie, and I think despite his best efforts, Edward really didn't know how to help Miss Jennie through her depression. She began to manifest significant signs of what we would know today as a chronic level of depression. She began to develop some coping mechanisms, I think, to help her gain some control in her life. But from the time that her last child was buried, she would never wear anything out in public other than a funeral dress. She began to become more and more withdrawn from the Fairview community in general. She was seen out less and less. And she would develop these coping mechanisms and behaviors where she would become more reclusive, become more of a shut-in. She would have a locksmith come to their home and change all of the locks on all of the doors throughout the house. And Miss Jennie had a separate skeleton key to get into each door in the home. I think that was her trying to find some way to gain some control in her life. But people in the community would witness this, and at times they weren't as understanding or at times even cruel in their characterization of what had happened to Miss Jennie. Today we would know that she was understandably a mother who was going through an incredibly difficult grieving process, and a grieving process that was exacerbated because she had lost all of her children, not just the daughter who recently died, but years before, having lost two other children. There was not the level of understanding for her difficulties that we would have today. And I think as Miss Jennie felt that presence, it forced her to become even more reclusive than she had been before. No doubt it was a difficult period for her and Dr. Stewart. They remained devoted to each other. They continued to help each other, and Dr. Stewart's practice continued to be very successful. But no doubt, through those difficult years, they were at times sad, at times lonely. They supported each other the best that they can. They remained devoted to each other. Their love was never in any doubt, but one can understand how difficult it must have been for them. They entered their autumn years as a couple without children. That had to be very difficult for them, but as tough Western Kentucky, I think they probably felt about themselves as pioneer people. They persevered, they made the best of what they had, and they made the best of what life gave them, and they had strong faith to carry them on. And I think Dr. Stewart and Miss Jennie understood the very critical mission that Dr. Stewart had, which was to be a physician and care for the people in this area, and he was very dedicated to that. One day, as they were an older couple in the early 20th century, in the late part of the first decade of the 1900s, Miss Jennie decided that she needed to make a shopping trip. She wanted to ride in her buggy, horse-drawn buggy, into Hopkinsville to go to a dry goods store there in downtown Hopkinsville, at the corner of 9th and Main Streets in Hopkinsville. She announced that morning to Dr. Stewart that she was going to have a young lady from the Fairview community accompany her in her buggy, and she was going to make the almost 2-hour trip to Hopkinsville from Fairview to go to the dry goods store and purchase some things that she needed for the home. Miss Jennie and the young lady made that trip, and we don't know exactly what happened as they parked their buggy and Miss Jennie was getting out of her wagon to go into the dry goods store. But somehow an article of her clothing or a bootstrap, something caused her to slip and fall as she was getting out of her buggy, and she fell and hit the hard pavement on the streets of Hopkinsville at that time. It was a devastating injury. The young lady that was with Miss Jennie knew immediately how seriously hurt she was. A couple of physicians who practiced in Hopkinsville happened to be in the downtown area that morning, and they immediately came to Miss Jennie's aid. They were able to ascertain very quickly that she had an injury that was not common and one that was not going to be easily remedied. They identified, most certainly with a street side examination, that Miss Jennie had likely broken her hip. Today, we think about broken hips as a serious orthopedic injury, but certainly one that has almost a 100% chance of recovery. Even for those in our community who are older, orthopedic medicine has seen tremendous advancements over the past 100 years. And we can, as healthcare professionals, we can so readily deal with injuries like broken hips today. But in 1908, a broken hip was essentially a death sentence for an American who was in their 60s or 70s. That was considered a very old age in that day and time. And there was really not the technology, and the physicians did not have the capability to perform the surgery needed to correct a broken hip in someone who was Miss Jennie's age. Those physicians knew that that injury was going to be fatal for her. The interesting thing about this story is that at that time, in 1908, there was no hospital in Hopkinsville, no acute care hospital. Western State Hospital had been formed and opened in 1854, but it was at that time and had always been a psychiatric institution. They did not have the capability to provide acute care for medical illnesses at Western State. And a hospital did not exist in Hopkinsville. Hospitals had not yet truly come into their own. It would be some years into the future before hospitals became commonplace in communities across our country. So the physicians really had a dilemma as they were ascertaining how they were going to provide care to Miss Jennie. They knew she was a very important person. The young lady that was with her had communicated to them that she was Dr. Stewart of Fairview's wife. And they knew that she needed the best medical attention that was available to them. They were resourceful enough to recognize that there was a nurse in the community, a wonderful, dedicated nurse by the name of Miss Wanda Williams, who had worked with some Hopkinsville physicians to establish what she referred to as the Hopkinsville Infirmary. And this was an institution designed to provide palliative care, really end-of-life care for patients in the community who had become so ill or who had so many medical conditions that it was really not within their family's power to provide care for them at that point in time in their life. And in some cases, they were individuals who had no family in their home. Perhaps their family members had moved away, or their spouse had died and they were living alone and they had no other resources. Miss Wanda provided, through the Hopkinsville Infirmary, a tremendous resource for people to get end-of-life care. And so those physicians worked with the young lady who had accompanied Miss Jennie, and by sending word to Miss Wanda, they made arrangements to have Miss Jennie transported to the Hopkinsville Infirmary, where Miss Wanda cared for her for 1 to 2 weeks while they waited for what they referred to as sepsis to settle in and for Miss Jennie to ultimately pass away. It was during this time that Miss Jennie was in the Hopkinsville Infirmary that Dr. Stewart traveled almost daily to Hopkinsville. He did his best to maintain his patient visit schedule in Fairview, but he would travel almost daily to Hopkinsville to check on his wife. Obviously, he was very concerned about Miss Jennie's condition, and as a physician, he was prepared to accept the consequences of what would most certainly be her ultimate death. After Miss Jennie passed away, she was buried in Riverside Cemetery, where her marker is to this very day. As Dr. Stewart was now a widower, and we were looking at about the year 1909, it was that spring that a couple of nieces contacted him and indicated that they wanted to come to Fairview to pay Dr. Stewart a visit. They had not been able to travel to Miss Jennie's funeral, and they wanted to come and pay their respects to their beloved aunt, and really to help Dr. Stewart set up so he could comfortably live the remainder of his life as a widower. We know so much about that visit from the great niece, who was a young girl of about 12 at that time. She and her mother made the trip from Illinois to Western Kentucky, where they traveled to Dr. Stewart and Miss Jennie's home in Fairview. The great niece, as an older lady, wrote a detailed account of her visit and shared it with the hospital administration in the 1950s. And that's how today we know so much about what transpired during her visit with her mother to Hopkinsville and to Fairview, where they helped Dr. Stewart. She said that it was a time of awakening for her. She was on the cusp of becoming a teenager, would very soon be an adult in the 19-teens West Kentucky society. And so everything was opening up for her, and she felt a real sense of purpose and a mission in life. She loved Dr. Stewart and Miss Jennie very much, and she was excited about what she was going to be able to do to help Dr. Stewart. She noted in her correspondence that she was always excited about dinner time, because that would be the time of day when they were visiting Dr. Stewart, that he would come in from his daily patient rounds, and he would be filled with stories and tales of his adventures and of his practice in medicine. We have to keep in mind that these were many, many years before the inception of federal laws like HIPAA, where we have to be extremely conscientious about what information in our patient care is shared. And Dr. Stewart, I'm sure, had plenty of interesting stories that he shared from the delivery of his medical care in the Fairview area. She said he was very entertaining and was always a great storyteller. One evening in particular, during the stay that she and her mother had with Dr. Stewart, he began talking and telling humorous stories about his wife, Miss Jennie. She said he was in a particularly good mood one evening and was telling her mother and was telling her the stories about how Miss Jennie liked to hide things and how she liked to save things. And to the extent he said she liked to hide things so much, sometimes she would even hide herself away in the house. And he would come home in the middle of the day to find the house locked up. And she would open a window and tell him to go away and to come back later. And he said in the evening, he would always ask her, why were you locked away in the house? Why would you not let me in? And he said, she never would give me a straight answer. She would always say something to the effect of, oh, I was just puttering. He said, but I had my suspicions in terms of what she may have been up to. And so this conversation and this tale really intrigued his great niece and her mother. And they began to talk with Dr. Stewart about what it was Miss Jennie may have been hiding in the home through all those years. Dr. Stewart liked to talk about the fact that Miss Jennie had hiding places all throughout the home. He said she's got hiding places everywhere. Well, based on family legend and stories that had been told through the greater Stewart family, the great niece and her mother knew some of the stories about how Miss Jennie liked to hide things. So they got their uncle to agree to allow them to search the Stewart home from top to bottom the following day. And they hatched a plan that they were going to search for everything that they could find that perhaps Miss Jennie had hidden through the years. That following morning, the nieces awoke and began their search. It didn't take them long as they began to open up the cabinet doors and the cupboards in the pantry downstairs, and they began to work through the jars of canned goods and very quickly began to find little spindled rolls of white paper tied with a string. As they would remove the string and uncurl the paper, they noticed that the paper was covering varying rolls, and it was denominations of currency, various amounts from time to time. When Miss Jennie would get in the mood, she would have a stack of money and she would just roll up 5s and 10s and 20s and cover them with a piece of paper and tie them with a string. But it wasn't just a plain piece of paper. Miss Jennie would take a pencil and she would write a limerick on each note, something that would carry a hallmark or a platitude about the benefits of saving money. Miss Jennie was known by Dr. Stewart and throughout her family and even in the community as being very frugal. Everyone knew she was good at business and good at building wealth, and she was very resourceful. But Miss Jennie had a message that she wanted to leave behind to people that would find this money. And so she would write a couple of the examples that I can recall. One of the pieces of paper said, "Money burns holes in some people's pockets, but not Miss Jennie's. Miss Jennie saves hers." Another one said, "Other wives would spend this money as soon as their husbands gave it to them, but not Miss Jennie. Miss Jennie saves hers for a rainy day." She would always refer to herself in the third person, and she would always have a message about the benefits of being frugal. The nieces were amazed as they began to find more and more of these little rolled up pieces of paper tied with a string, wrapping currency. And they began to find this as they cleaned through the cupboards in the pantry. The mother had heard through family lore that Miss Jennie liked to hide things behind the artwork in the home, so they began to take the artwork off of the walls in the Stewart home, and sure enough, in the pockets of the artwork, they began to find all of these official-looking documents. A quick read began to reveal to the mother and her daughter that Miss Jennie, when she wasn't in the mood to take cash and curl up the denominations of currency and write limericks and tie it with a string, she was busy reading the newspaper. And if she found out that a bank was issuing new stock, or perhaps a new bank was starting in Western Kentucky, or a buggy manufacturer, or a manufacturer that would maybe make saddles, or any type of manufacturing was beginning in the area, Miss Jennie was usually one of the first people in the area to line up to buy stock. What they had found behind the pictures on the walls in the Stewart home were stock certificates. They were amazed at the volume of stock Miss Jennie had acquired and the number of stock certificates that she had in her possession. I can only imagine the excitement when Dr. Stewart walked through that front door in the evening. I'm sure the niece and the great niece just confronted him immediately with remarks of excitement about the treasures that they had found in the Stewart home. I suspect Dr. Stewart knew a little bit about what was likely there. I don't think he was entirely clueless, but I'm sure he was even a little bit surprised to the extent to which Miss Jennie had been savvy in terms of her acquisition of stock and the way that she saved her currency. At dinner that night, Dr. Stewart had to have just been thinking about the implications and what the finding of this wealth could mean. He told his nieces at dinner that evening, he said, "You know, on our wedding night, I made a bargain with Miss Jennie." And he said, "I told her, Miss Jennie, during our marriage relationship, it's going to be my job to make the money, but it's going to be your job to save it." And he looked at his nieces and he said, "You know, I never had any idea just how good a job she had done holding up her end of the bargain." I'm sure they were very entertained by his stories about Miss Jennie. And Dr. Stewart asked them at the conclusion of dinner, he said, "I believe you've missed Miss Jennie's favorite hiding spot." And so after dinner, he takes the young niece, puts a coal oil lamp in her hand, and takes her to a closet underneath the stairwell at the front of the home. And he explains to her that at the very narrowest portion of the closet, there's a trap door that leads underneath the Stewart home. And he indicates to his niece that since she is the youngest, she's the one that most approximates the size of Miss Jennie, and is probably, of the three of them in the home that night, the only one that can fit into what he described as Miss Jennie's favorite hiding spot. I'm sure she was apprehensive about working her way through that closet with just a flickering coal oil lamp. And she tells in her letter how she made it to the trap door and she opened it up, and how she took the light and cast it into the space underneath the Stewart home. And she said she kind of got halfway into the space and stayed halfway in the closet. It was like she was scared to go all the way in, and she cast the light about. And she called back out to her mother and her uncle, Dr. Stewart. And she said, "There's nothing under the house. I just see a couple of old pipes." And she pleaded for her uncle to let her come back out and join them in the entryway of the home. Dr. Stewart reminded his great niece, and you have to think this was about 1909, most homes in Western Kentucky, if not all homes in Western Kentucky at that point in time, were homes that did not have electricity or plumbing. And so he indicated to his great niece that if there were pipes underneath their house, they were important and they had to come out. She crawled into the space and she talked about how heavy, how tremendously heavy these fairly long sections of iron pipe were. And she recounted how difficult it was to grab these sections of pipe and to pull them far enough into the closet that her mother and Dr. Stewart could help her drag them the rest of the way. When she emerged from the closet, probably none too soon as far as she was concerned, she noticed, as did her uncle and her mother, that these fairly long sections of iron pipe were capped on both ends. Dr. Stewart went to his shop, retrieved some tools, came back, and they began to remove these caps from the ends of these fairly long sections of iron pipe. And when they turned the pipe up to expose the contents, out onto the floor of the Stewart home began to pour gold pieces. The pipes were literally filled with gold pieces. I can only imagine how the great niece and her mother and Dr. Stewart felt to see that much gold that had been saved and meticulously put into these long sections of iron pipe. It must have taken years for Miss Jennie to accumulate that much gold and that much wealth and to meticulously store it every few weeks or every few months and hide it away in the house. And Dr. Stewart recognized that that began to explain why she would lock herself away and she didn't want anyone to be aware of what she was doing in the house at that time. I think that Dr. Stewart recognized fairly quickly when he saw the gold that the stock certificates, the cash, the gold, I think unlike if we're honest with ourselves, we would begin to think about all the wonderful luxuries that life could bring to us with that kind of wealth. And I think Dr. Stewart had a love for Miss Jennie that was so great. He understood that she had made, while he had earned the wealth, she had made the availability and the existence of the wealth in its current state possible through her mission, her attitude, her thrift, and he wanted to see something tremendous happen with that. He wanted that wealth to serve a purpose that was far greater in life than providing him luxuries or providing an inheritance to a family member. And so he shared with his nieces that he wanted their help in researching a concept that he had heard about called the Community Trust Hospital. He had heard about a hospital in Illinois that was started in a community not much bigger than Hopkinsville. And wealthy benefactors in the community had pooled their wealth to help fund the construction of a hospital that was available in that community to all persons. And it was a place where people could go and get better. They could heal. It was not a place of experimentation and a place of death. And he wanted to create an institution like that in Hopkinsville. And he knew that Miss Jennie, through her actions in life, could be memorialized in her death with such a project. And so the nieces agreed to help him research the concept. And his work began immediately. He had some young men the following day ride with him into Hopkinsville. They helped him secure the wealth. We know today that this was somewhere close to $50,000 that Miss Jennie had accumulated in stock and cash and gold. Those young men rode with Dr. Stewart to ensure that wealth was safely deposited in what was then National City Bank. Dr. Stewart had a vision for what he wanted to create as a legacy for the memory of his beloved wife. And he immediately set out to find trusted individuals who were leaders in the business community in Hopkinsville. And he pulled them together in a meeting one evening, and he said, my wife, Miss Jennie Stewart, through her thrift and devotion, has accumulated great wealth through her lifetime. I want to turn over that wealth to you as leaders in this community, and I want you to develop an articles of incorporation. I want you to develop a set of bylaws. I want you to retain an architect, retain a contractor, and I want you to build and equip a first-class hospital that will be available to all persons in this area, regardless of their background or their religion or their ability to pay for their care. And the only real condition, he had a number of small conditions. He wanted her rose garden transplanted to the new hospital site. He wanted to make sure that if any member of his family ever needed a place to stay, that they could seek shelter in this facility. But the true condition that he put on the donation of this true fortune in that day and time, The only real condition he put on that is that he wanted what would become the first acute care hospital in Hopkinsville to be named for his wife. He wanted it to be named Jennie Stewart Memorial Hospital. That group of leaders accepted that challenge wholeheartedly. They knew that the dynamics of healthcare were rapidly changing. Physicians and medical schools had learned so much about healthcare in the decades following the Civil War. They learned about antiseptic technique. They learned about the importance of cleanliness and daily cleaning of the environment to reduce infection and to create the proper healing environment. They had begun to develop pharmaceuticals that were helpful. Anesthesia was making significant inroads in terms of allowing surgeries to occur and for patients to have life-saving and health-fulfilling surgeries with much less pain. Pharmaceutical development was creating drugs that were actually helping people fight infections and to heal faster, not just the patent medicines that were popular in the 19th century. Surgical techniques were improving. Infant mortality was able to be reduced. Healthcare was changing dynamically. The importance of nursing as a profession was coming to the forefront. Lab technologies were improving. Imaging technologies were coming to the forefront, and the dawn of the purpose and the real mission and success of a hospital was beginning to be defined. And those community leaders knew that Dr. Stewart's vision for a hospital was timely, and it was the perfect time to launch it. They took his challenge, and within a year and a half, they had not only incorporated Jennie Stewart Memorial Hospital, but they had retained an architect and a contractor and had built and equipped a first-class hospital that was available to all persons in the area. It was a warm summer day, July 2nd, 1914, that Dr. Stewart traveled to hospital for a historic event. And it was on that day that Dr. Stewart and the original Board of Trustees of Jennie Stewart Memorial Hospital unveiled a brand new 3-story state-of-the-art facility that was open to the public for health care. And it was no doubt a proud moment for Dr. Stewart, but it was one that he lamented his wife could not be with him to share. But it was on that day that the Board of Trustees introduced the first administrator of Jennie Stewart Memorial Hospital to the community that gathered that day to celebrate the first hospital in Hopkinsville. And the administrator that was introduced to the community that day by Dr. Stewart was none other than the wonderful nurse who had taken care of Miss Jennie on her deathbed, Miss Wanda Williams. And with the advent of Jennie Stewart Memorial Hospital, she was able to close the Hopkinsville Infirmary, which had been kind of a makeshift institution of care for people in significant need. And she was able to put her energies and her talents to work in growing and developing this new concept, this new hospital that existed for the benefit of the community and the people in the area for which it served. And it was an exciting day indeed. Miss Wanda took the helm of Jennie Stewart Memorial Hospital that July day in 1914 and led the hospital through the first several decades of its very difficult journey to success. Through the 19 teens and World War I, through the roaring 20s and the era of Prohibition, through the very difficult years of the 1930s and the Great Depression, and all the way through World War II before she finally retired. When Miss Wanda retired in 1946, she turned the hospital over to a new generation of nurses and hospital staff and leadership who was ready to take the hospital into the modern era. But her contribution is remembered every day when we think about the challenges that she faced and the success that she implemented in bringing our hospital to the modern era. I hope you've enjoyed the wonderful story and the history of Jennie Stewart Health, from our very humble beginnings as a 28-bed hospital on that warm July day in 1914. We unveiled a state-of-the-art hospital in that era, and today we're proud to have a state-of-the-art hospital in our era. Today we're a 200-bed regional referral facility serving 7 counties in Western Kentucky. We're proud of our history, and we're proud of the impact that we have as we move forward in the future. Thank you, and we look forward to working with you here at Jennie Stewart Health.